It's a little after 2 in the morning, and your grandmother hasn't spoken in 3 days. The hospital room hums with the small sounds machines make when they're keeping someone alive. A soft beep, the hiss of oxygen. Somewhere down the hall, a cartwheel squeaks against linoleum. You've been sitting in the same chair so long your legs have gone numb, watching her chest rise and fall, shallow and slow. For 3 days she hasn't opened her eyes. The nurses use the word transitioning, gently, the way people do when they mean something they don't want to say outright. You've made your peace with what's coming, or you think you have, right up until the moment her hand moves. You freeze. Her fingers close around yours. Her eyes open and they are clear. Not confused, not glassy, not the half-focused stare she's had for days. Clear, the way they used to be, the way you remember them from a decade ago, before any of this started. She says your name. Then she says something else, something specific, something that sounds less like a dying woman's confusion and more like a message she's been saving. She tells you she loves you. She tells you not to worry. And then, just as suddenly as she arrived, she's gone again, eyes closing, breath slowing back into that same shallow rhythm. She dies 11 hours later. You will spend a long time afterward wondering what that was. A last burst of willpower. A fluke. Something her body did on its way out that happened to look, for one unbearable minute, exactly like her. Here's the strange part. It probably wasn't random at all. In 2009, a biologist named Michael Naum and a psychiatrist named Bruce Grayson gave this moment a name: terminal lucidity. The unexpected return of mental clarity and memory in the hours or days before death, in people who, by every medical measure, should not have been capable of it anymore. Not just people gently drifting off after a long illness. People with advanced dementia who hadn't recognized their own children in years. People with severe, lifelong cognitive disabilities who had never spoken in complete sentences at all. One of the most striking cases Naum and Grayson documented involved a woman who had lived with a profound intellectual disability her entire life and had never been known to speak or sing with any clarity. In her final hours, she sang, clearly and at length, to the astonishment of the caregivers who had known her for years. Naum and Grayson combed through medical case reports going back more than 2 centuries and found the same pattern surfacing again and again. A mind assumed to be gone, showing up one last time, right at the door. And this isn't some rare miracle whispered about at bedsides. Research since then estimates that when this kind of lucid episode happens, something close to half the people who experience it die within 24 hours. The vast majority are gone within a week. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If a brain that has been failing for years can suddenly, briefly, work again, right before it stops working forever, what exactly is happening in there? For a long time, nobody could say. Doctors had 2 options: call it a fluke, or don't call it anything at all, because talking about a temporary miracle sounds unscientific, and pretending it doesn't happen feels like a lie to the families who have watched it. But there's a second thread to this story, and it comes from a very different kind of witness. Hospice nurses Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelly spent more than 20 years combined at the bedsides of the dying, and they noticed something that had nothing to do with sudden clarity. It was quieter than that. Patients in their final days would often start speaking in a kind of code, using the language of departure. They'd talk about needing to pack, or catch a ride, or find their way somewhere, even when they were far too weak to sit up, let alone travel anywhere at all. They'd describe people standing in the room who weren't there, usually someone they'd loved who had died years before, and they'd sometimes name the exact day they expected to go, days in advance, with an eerie kind of confidence. Callanan and Kelly called it nearing death awareness, and the pattern showed up too often, across too many patients who had never spoken to each other, for the 2 nurses to write it off as coincidence. It looked less like confusion and more like a part of the dying mind that somehow already knew where it was headed, and was trying, however clumsily, in whatever language it had left, to tell the people in the room. Two separate phenomena. A body of doctors documenting sudden clarity, a body of nurses documenting symbolic knowing. Neither group had a mechanism. Neither could point to the thing actually happening inside a dying brain to cause either of it. That changed in a laboratory in Michigan, and it changed because of rats. In 2013, a neuroscientist named Jimo Borjajan wired up a group of rats to monitor their brain activity, then induced cardiac arrest. The assumption going in was simple. When the heart stops, the brain runs out of oxygen, and its activity should collapse quietly, the way a radio fades to static when you lose the signal. That is not what happened. In the 30 seconds after each rat's heart stopped, its brain produced a surge, a sharp spike of a specific kind of electrical activity called gamma waves, the fastest signals a brain generates, strongly associated with focused, conscious thought. Not a fade to static, a burst of the loudest signal the brain has. Borjajan spent the next decade chasing the human version of that finding, and in 2022, she got it by chance. An 87-year-old man was undergoing a routine brain scan for epilepsy when his heart suddenly stopped. His EEG kept recording. Right around the moment of death, his brain lit up with the same pattern seen in the rats. A burst of gamma waves, concentrated in a region of the brain nicknamed the posterior hot zone, an area linked to dreaming, memory, and vivid visual experience. One case wasn't proof. So in 2023, Borjajan's team went looking for more, reviewing the records of 4 comatose patients who had been taken off life support in the hospital, all beyond medical help, all being monitored right up until the end. In 2 of the 4, the same thing happened again. As their hearts stopped, their brains surged, gamma waves spiking to levels far above anything seen in ordinary waking thought, concentrated in exactly the region tied to conscious perception. Borjajan herself put it simply. The old assumption had always been that a dying brain goes dark quietly, like a house with the power cut. What her data showed instead was something closer to every light in the house flaring at once, right before the breaker finally trips. Here's where the 3 threads finally meet. A dementia patient regaining 30 minutes of clarity she hadn't had in years. A hospice patient describing a journey she can't otherwise explain, days before she takes it. A dying brain producing a burst of the exact electrical signature associated with vivid conscious experience, right as the heart gives out. None of these researchers were looking for each other's work. A biologist cataloging historical case reports, 2 hospice nurses comparing notes at the bedside, a neuroscientist running EEGs on rats and later on dying patients in the ICU. 3 completely separate investigations, decades apart, arriving at strangely overlapping evidence for the same idea. Dying may not be a fade to silence at all. It may be a surge. And a surge like that might explain more than just the strange clarity of a dying grandmother or the symbolic language of a hospice patient. It might be the same mechanism behind near-death experiences themselves, the vivid tunnels of light, the sense of floating outside the body, the overwhelming feeling of reviewing an entire life in an instant, all reported by survivors of cardiac arrest with a consistency that has puzzled researchers for decades. If the brain really does throw everything it has into one last burst of activity in the region responsible for vivid perception, a rush of experience compressed into a handful of seconds would feel, from the inside, exactly like an eternity. Which would mean the question in the title of this video isn't hypothetical. It isn't a thought experiment about some imagined future where technology gives us all a countdown. It's a question about something that may already be happening quietly at the edge of nearly every human death, largely undocumented, because it happens in a window too brief and too private for most of us to witness, let alone study properly. If that's true, It changes something important about how we treat the people we're losing. For a long time, the instinct at a deathbed has been to explain away the strange moments. The sudden lucidity gets filed under a fluke. The talk of journeys and visitors gets filed under confusion or medication. It's easier in the moment to reach for an explanation that doesn't ask anything of us, because really listening means accepting that something is ending, and accepting that is hard. But if the dying brain really does light up one final time, then those moments deserve to be treated as exactly what they might be: real, brief, and worth listening to, not despite the fact that a person is dying, but because of it. A family that leans in during that window, instead of dismissing it, might be the only audience a person ever gets for the truest thing they have left to say. There's a harder question underneath all of this, too, one none of these three research threads can fully answer yet. Is that final surge simply a mechanical last gasp, neurons firing as oxygen runs out, meaningless the way static is meaningless? Or is it something closer to a message, shaped by a lifetime of memory and love, aimed outward at the people still in the room? Nobody currently studying the dying brain claims to know for certain. But the fact that the question is even being asked seriously, in peer-reviewed journals and hospital EEG labs instead of dismissed as folklore, is itself new. Which brings you back to that hospital room, at 2 in the morning, your grandmother's hand closing around yours. You used to think what happened that night was a fluke, a strange gift you got lucky enough to receive, something you'd never be able to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. Now you're not so sure it was luck at all. Maybe it was exactly what the data suggests happens far more often than anyone's counted. A brain, at the very last possible moment, gathering everything it has left into one final, deliberate signal, aimed squarely at the person holding its hand. Either way, you don't think of that moment as strange anymore. You think of it